Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here today on this February 28th, 2022. I am Nick Kanoki, the Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I am very excited for today's roundtable about infrastructure spending. Before we get underway, I just want to thank ALN patron members, Definitive Logic, Onuma System, ABS Quality Evaluations, and ABS Group, as well as our growing list of organizational members. If you're interested in joining the growing list, please reach out to anyone at the ALN and we can talk more about how we can work together. And then before we get started with this event, I just want to mention our upcoming events. March 2nd, so Wednesday, we have the start of our Municipal Asset Leadership web series. And we're starting off with how the US can benefit from proven international asset management approaches. From Ashay Prabhu of the Sita. And then Thursday, we have Richard Culberson on our every Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern program. And then on March 8th, the Municipal Asset Leadership web series continues. And then last event I'll mention right now is March 15th through 16th, our summit on sustainable value creation from infrastructure asset leadership. And with that, I would just say, if you're out there watching, we would love to hear from you. So please send any comments, questions, or feedback to the chat, or use the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar. And Jim Dieter, why don't you start us off with today's event, CEO of the ALN.
Great, thanks, Nick. Welcome everybody in attendance, and welcome to our panelists today. One of the great, is it a blessing? Is that the word of the ALN? Is we have just an amazing array of people that get involved and present at our events. And today is certainly a great example of that. Some very different backgrounds and sectors that people work in that we can bring to the table today and try to share some ideas and shed some light on how asset management and asset leadership can or could or does impact the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So we're going to start with just a brief go around of introductions. And I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves. So I'm Jim Dieter, CEO of the Asset Leadership Network and asset management consultant. Dan, perhaps would you like to go next?
Sure, thanks, Jim. So my name is Dan Matthews, and I've been involved with federal real estate for about 25 years now. Spent a couple decades on Capitol Hill on the committee that oversees a lot of federal infrastructure, the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, and specifically the Public Buildings Committee, subcommittee. And then I spent just about 4 years as the commissioner of the Public Building Service at GSA. And most recently, I'm now at WeWork, the flexible workspace provider.
And is that your first public sector job? Have you always been in the government before that?
No, I had a couple of stints in the private sector early in my career, but I started on Capitol Hill, left, kept coming back. It's a place that kind of does that to you. It's a fun place to work, so it keeps drawing you back in.
There you go. And I'm pleased to have Sita Egan with us today, who we'll ask her to introduce herself in a minute. But I can say that she was an attendee at one of our recent events. And I thought, oh, she'd be a great person to get involved in this. And she accepted. So we're thrilled to get to know Sita today. So welcome, Sita.
Thank you. So my name is Sita Egan. I work with the Bureau of Reclamation. I am part of the Dam Safety and Infrastructure Directorate. And we're based in Denver. So I'm part of the Asset Management Division. And I supervise the Infrastructure Investment and Management branch, which covers capital planning, our asset inventory, our Maximo system, as well as title transfer and disposal. And most recently, I've been involved in strategic asset management. So that involves strategic asset management plan, as well as asset management training. So I'm happy to participate today. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, a lot to talk about there. Jack Kelly?
Hi, so I'm Jack Kelly. I have been I'm getting some weird feedback here. So, so I've been a member of the ALN since 2015, I think. I retired in 2013 from 36 years with the Office of Management and Budget, where I spent a lot of time on various management policies and GSA's budget for most of that time. So basically, most recently, I've been involved in working on an international standard that talks about a new international standard that addresses the issue of how public policy and asset management can communicate more effectively together so that public policy is better informed in terms of opportunities to engage asset management. We may talk a little bit about that later.
Great, thanks, Johnny. And Chris Roberts, welcome, sir.
Good afternoon, Jim and everyone. Thank you. My name is Chris Roberts. I am a principal with KPMG, which is a professional services, and I specialize in infrastructure advisory, have done for the last close to 30 years now, on not just in the US for the last 10 years or so, but scattered across the globe as well. I'm also the global president, the president of the Institute of Asset Management, which is a professional body for asset management professionals, and I'm a board director and secretary for the Global Forum for Asset Management and Maintenance as well.
Oh, thank you, Chris. And Peter Dodgion of the Army Corps of Engineers had planned to join us, and he may still show up. Mike Ordinaro is probably texting him right now to see if he's going to be able to make it today. But that's good. We can move right along. So we're going to start with just allowing each person, each of the panelists, to share some thoughts. I might share a few at the end of that, of my own, around this topic of how we can make a success from an asset management and asset leadership perspective of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So I think there's a lot of room to get into it. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, you can just Google IIJA, and it'll bring up the 1,000 whatever pages, 10 pages of contents or more, and there's a lot in there. So I'm always amazed. Maybe somebody can give us, Dan or Jack can give us a clue on how in the world such a document ever gets put together, because just amazing detail as it goes forward. At any rate, might as well keep the same order if I can remember that. So Dan, I think you were first.
Sure, thanks. So first off, just let me say thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I know when I was in government, you all used to come by quite a bit when I was on Capitol Hill, which was very useful to hear your perspective on asset management and help educate Congress. Because quite frankly, Congress's expertise and their staff expertise is really about moving legislation and policy. It's not about real estate and asset management. And so there's a huge role for, I think, groups like this to really educate Congress. And when you look at this giant bill, you asked, how does a bill like that happen? Well, like my old committee, the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, they've been working on these issues for literally 240 years. One of the very first bills ever to pass Congress was to fund the construction of the White House and the Capitol. So public assets, public infrastructure was literally like some of the very first legislation Congress ever passed, and they've been working on it ever since. And so they've got a wish list, and these big bills only come around every so often. So they literally have things that they've been working on for years, and they're looking for a vehicle, a train to put it on when you have an opportunity like this. So that's really what happened. And you literally see in this bill all sorts of different issue areas that have been priorities for different members, different areas, different committees and whatnot, that just had never really been able to get over the finish line. And they hitched a ride on this train. They're infrastructure related. A lot of things, frankly, weren't infrastructure related that ended up on the bill and got passed. But there's some really massive core programs that really break down into your classic federal infrastructure, aviation, rail, surface transportation, highways, ports and waterways and things like that, and even some money for buildings. And every agency got their own little pocket of money for a variety of things. But if there's a theme that sort of goes through that bill, it's very much about climate change and resilience and sustainability. And I think that's going to be an important part. In a way, they picked up on the theme from the 2009 our infrastructure bill and carried it forward. And when I look back at that bill, and particularly within the realm of GSA, which is where I had a lot more experience. And if I think about, what went well, what didn't go so well, and now that they have an opportunity to do it again, what should they think about? And the main thing I would say is there's a huge temptation to take this money and kind of sprinkle it across assets, all these different assets. And there's a whole variety of reasons why, they might be motivated to do that. But the problem with that approach is you end up with assets then that just have a piece of what they need to be recapitalized. And then they're really not fully functional, and they have no chance of getting the remainder balance of the capital that they need to fully recapitalize. I can just think of a variety of buildings, GSA's buildings, where they put a green roof on it, but they didn't replace the plumbing, the mechanical, the electrical, or the building envelope. And the building leaks like crazy, the pipes break, and it's bleeding tenants. But it's got a great green roof, and it could never get the money afterwards to finish it. So, but again, there was a desire to kind of sprinkle the money around, shovel-ready projects, and that meant things that were ready to go right now, not necessarily a whole building renovation. But when they did do whole building renovations, that's really where they saw the biggest bang for the bucks. And the real transformation of an asset into not just a sustainable asset, but also a financially viable asset, because GSA has a revolving fund. They charge rent, they have to make money in order to pay all their expenses. And when they renovated a whole asset, they also improved the financial viability of that asset. And that's a really important thing. They need to look at the finances of an asset in addition to the capital requirements. There's just a couple ideas to think about.
A couple, yeah. That's a lot. Wow. So decision making stood out to me in what you said. And just sort of thinking about, I think the strength of the ISO 55000 structured approach is it gives you, it doesn't tell you what to think, but it gives you a structured approach to making decisions like that. And it's striking that it's so hard to do. It's striking. But yes.
When you're in those positions, right, you have a lot of competing priorities, and oftentimes, right, you have people, political appointees that are in charge of the agencies that might not have that much background in asset management. Actually, they probably don't. It'd probably be unusual if they did, frankly, and so, but they have a lot of pressure to act quickly, and hopefully in those situations, right, they'll reach out to the right type of frankly outside and internal sources that they have to help guide them in that. I found it very helpful to bring in outside consultants in addition to like the in-house expertise that we had within GSA to bring to bear on issues like that when we, got a big slug of money for courthouses, for example, was what happened when I was there. And there's a lot of money, a lot of desire to get it out the door quickly. But that's not always the easiest thing to do. You want to end up with an asset that is, again, financially viable and also effective for what it's going to do, and a complete project, so that you're not, we don't have those situations where you got the green roof, but the rest of the building's still falling apart and then you lose your tenants. And that kind of principle, I think, can apply in a lot of different areas as well, because the needs are so great, even with the money that was made available for different sectors of infrastructure, what the federal government holds anyways, it probably isn't really close. In GSA's case, it's not close to what they actually need to recapitalize things that they already own.
It's crazy we've gotten ourselves in that position, that we're in a hole that it's impossible to imagine, getting ourselves out of. And we can put, so much money into these various areas, and it's only a fraction of the amount that's needed. It's yeah, and I guess the success stories that I'm heard that sound the best to me are organizations that make decisions about where they're going to spend the money before they have the money. And they can take a little more thoughtful process rather than jump right into it. Okay, good. Well, Sita, your organization obviously is taken a good jaunt down the road of asset management. How does this look from your perspective?
Just to follow up on a note that Dan mentioned, was that it is a little more comprehensive, where it's not just focused on the assets. It's not just putting money in our physical assets, but for reclamation, it really is a once in a generation opportunity to tackle different program areas and different issues. So in addition to infrastructure modernization, there's conservation, ecosystem recovery, natural resources monitoring, dam safety, rural water, and then tribal water rights settlements. So I have some notes because there's so much in there, but I just appreciate the opportunity to address multiple different areas, addressing the water issues that we have. The bill provides us opportunity and resources to mitigate some of those impacts to drought, and water storage, water recycling, reuse, and there's a big influx on the water smart. So that, and I know that's a lot of the things that you hear about in the news from reclamation. But in terms of the actual infrastructure, we were given the opportunity to, over the next 5 years, $3.2 billion for aging infrastructure, and an additional $500 million specifically for dam safety modifications. So we've got some pretty big construction projects for dam safety that are coming down the line, but I think the funding really allows us to focus on all different assets or facets of some of the issues that we're facing for aging infrastructure. So one important note, at least for the context of our organization, is that we operate our assets in partnership with operating entities. So we own all of the infrastructure, the federal government owns it, but we have agreements and contracts with non-federal entities to perform the O&M. So that's been something that we've really highlighted, is that and this is where the asset management aspect comes in, is that it's not just the federal government. We're working in partnership with state, federal, state and local entities to really take care of our infrastructure. And this funding really helps to allow for that over the next couple of years. One of the bigger things in terms of asset management is that the law created, we have this fund that it provides funding into this aging infrastructure account that we're able to, that entities are able to apply for the funding to help address some of these needs. So and that the funding, the repayment of that goes back into this fund, which will really help us with the longevity of addressing this is really based on the long-term impacts. And that's really the game changer for reclamation, is that we're able to use this account for the long-term to be able to address these needs. And you mentioned, there's so much out there, and there's only so much that we can do at any given time. Our capability is something that we'll really need to focus on what's ready to go. Somebody mentioned, ARA. So I think this opportunity really gives us time to think about what comes next and what we're going to tackle in addition or alongside with our partners. So I think that's the biggest opportunity that we have as reclamation to be able to really tackle a lot of these issues that we've been monitoring and collecting over the last 14 years. I think we've talked about I know it's longer than that, but in terms of the asset management report to Congress that we sent forth in 2021, which really helped kind of guide us into where we are today. So I think it's a great opportunity for reclamation.
Awesome. Yeah, I like your comment that it that allows a longer term view, that it isn't money necessarily all that needs to be spent, in the next month, year, whatever. Boy, that's sure what we need. We need that long term view. Mike, there was a question for Sita. You want to jump in with that?
Yes, I'll do that. Thank you. Sita, one of the things that we're trying to do with this is to raise awareness of the value of a structured approach to asset management. And the fact that you had your asset management plan for 30 years in place is what allowed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to take 5 years of funding and give that to you. So, of course, in our ideal world, there would be a requirement for an asset management plan in order to get funding in the legislation. Are you able to kind of require or encourage an asset management plan for these state and local government and contractors that you're working with?
In terms of the requirements to place on others, we do have some oversight through our review programs with our operating entities. And so that's really part of, are they operating our assets to reclamation standards? And a lot of them do are very capable and have adopted the ISO standards. They have their own asset management plans. But some of them just have, they're operating reclamation assets versus others that have their own inventories and they're just operating a portion of reclamation assets. But I think that's a great point right now. We are focusing on at least our approach and our inventory. And then to the extent that we can, and we work with them, like I said, in partnership of, I don't know to the extent that we can require them to have an asset management plan, but when we update our needs, we look at the entire inventory. And I know this isn't getting exactly to what you're.
Well, the fact that you said that many of them have their own asset management plans, that is it right there. That was really encouraging to hear that.
Yeah, it's I think we work really closely. We've had lots of different meetings. Some of them are very capable. We're learning from them and trying to leverage and use them as best practices, or sharing with other entities of, hey, here's what's going on with this entity here. And it really depends on the size and the capability of that organization. And it varies from one end of the spectrum to the other. But that's something that we encourage, at least at the local level, at our area regions, is to really look at what others are doing.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that encouraging response. I'm glad to have that information.
Okay. Jack Kelly, how about your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I think Dan hit it right on the head in terms of the biggest challenge that we face with a bill like this. And that is, there's so many people who are clamoring for their little piece of the pie, that the pieces of the pie are all really small. And because there's no requirement for asset management plans and the structured approach to asset management, a lot of times it's the squeakiest of the wheels that gets some little dribble of money, and it's not enough to really, even if they had a good asset management plan and they knew the ideal way to spend the money, that the amount of money they're likely to get is not going to be sufficient. It's just, there are too many different little bird mouths open for their individual crumbs. And so it's kind of doomed. It's not doomed, but it's challenged from the start in terms of not thinking about that at the beginning, and not trying to focus your attention on, you know, the biggest bang for the buck. It's the most bangs for the buck. And so it's we're structurally challenged in terms of how we even think about putting this money together. And the thing that I find troubling is all the attention is placed on getting the money out, on the new money out, and not on how that new money is spent, but how's the existing money spent? Because we have, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars in the base that's spent every single year, and it's just spent in ways that aren't ideal. And so getting a critical mass of awareness of asset management. And I'm delighted that Sita's on the call, because, you know, Bureau Rec is one of the components that within the federal government that appreciates asset management. Corps of Engineers is another, WAPA is another. You know, we've Air Force. We've got these little centers of asset management awareness within agencies that are doing really good work. And all of them are kind of struggling, or at least most of the ones I know about are kind of struggling to get a broader adoption within their own organizations of asset management principles throughout the organization. Usually these little centers of excellence, you know, have their own spheres of influence, but they don't tend to be, you know, agency wide. They're just, you know, they're allowed to do good things within the boundaries that they're given. So the challenge is there's so many challenges. One is helping people like Sita and the folks in the Corps and the folks in other agencies that have got these little cores of asset management excellence, get the principles of asset management brought, you know, more widely adopted within their agencies, and then continuing the work that we in the ALN have been doing to make all people in the federal government aware of what the sort of the bright lights are doing. And so encourage more and more people to see the value of asset management and adopt it. One of the other points I just want to throw in is that it's interesting when you think about, and Dan mentioned the Transportation Infrastructure Committee. The Transportation Infrastructure Committee in the transportation area specifically, more specifically in the state highway program and in the federal transit programs, have required asset management plans of the grantees that are seeking grant funds. And so there's been this awareness of the importance of asset management and the value of asset management in the transportation world for actually quite some time. And in the water world, there's a similar, although less robust, awareness of it. But it's a couple things jump out at me. One, you know, we're eager, or we don't have any problem at all in the federal government of placing requirements on other levels of government. We have big challenges in being willing to place requirements on us that we have to follow. And so that's kind of that just seems to be an unfortunate fact of life. But I see promising signs out there. I think there is a growing awareness of the benefits of asset management. We just need to accelerate the growth of that awareness. And there's a lot of you know, good practices from around the world that we can acquaint U.S. decision makers with, and that's this other little project that I'm working on.
Yeah. So, thanks, Jack. You know, it's kind of striking that we, as a country, we're not really sure where we want to spend the money, and we have no organized approach to doing it. Well, that's an overstatement, but from a national perspective, you know, we have our national asset leadership strategy, which you know, has the audacious goal of helping us decide what the national objectives are and what assets we need to reach them. But we are far from that. You know, there's a general idea of what we need, but not anything that resembles a plan.
Well, no, because the political process, and I can't imagine that the United States is unique in this. All political processes are very sensitive to the stakeholders that seem most important to those processes, and there are just lots of them. And so it's, you know, you're trying to satisfy so many different people that that it's all about getting the money out to the people. And as Dan pointed out earlier, it's not necessarily getting the money out in a way that helps those people or requires those people to think about how they're going to use it in the most productive way. And you know, you'll remember this chat that we had a couple of days ago with Peter Kohler from Australia, and he talked about how Australia is at a point. Well, first of all, Australia has a national infrastructure plan, and its key states in Australia have state infrastructure plans. That's huge. And in the process of developing those plans, they had to go through, you know, they had to connect with all the different stakeholders and get people to say, well, you know, in this particular circumstance, transportation needs to get we've got more challenges in transportation versus water versus broadband versus other things. And so it was coming up with a consensus of the best way to spend the limited money that they have to accomplish the objectives of the nation or that state. And that's the right conversation to have. And also the other point that Peter made is it's really, really important to those, what they call the treasuries, which is like the OMBs of those countries, that the people are thinking about not just the amount of the budget requirement for this year's budget, but what is that annual requirement going to translate into in terms of long-term obligations, so that you have an idea of just, you know, how big a thing that you've taken on and how long it's going to represent that claim on your resources. And our budget process, at least when I was involved with it, wasn't set up to do that. I mean, it's all about what goes into the appropriations bill coming up. It's not what is the tail that this year's decision is going to cause, you know, downstream spending. What are and looking at that, at least from an analytical perspective. And I don't know whether Dan and his folks when he was at PBS, if they have a way of doing that, but that's certainly an important thing to do. I know the Air Force has spent a lot of time thinking about that.
Yeah, I just said there certainly is a lot more that could be done. In fact, the last about 6 months that I was there, I became frankly increasingly concerned about the owned portfolio of the Public Building Service because of the increasing age of the assets and the deterioration of quality over time, and the consistent lack of capital funding availability. So it just wasn't possible to move the total owned portfolio in the right direction. It's going in the wrong direction, and you really had to pick and choose which assets do you want to invest in. And I think about, you know, the infrastructure spending that's happened. You know, GSA, PBS was able to get $3.8 billion for land ports of entry. And you think about land ports of entry, right? A pretty specialized asset. You know, it's a border station, you know, in Canada and Mexico. All sorts of infrastructure involved, not just buildings, but roads and fencing and equipment and other things. And it's fixed, right? It's not moving anywhere, and it's essential. That's something you have to have. It's pretty specialized, and you need to keep it in good working condition. Courthouses, you know, another example of an asset class in the building space that is pretty unique, pretty specialized. Yes, I'm sure you can do a build-to-suit lease for a courthouse, but you know, because it's such a long-term asset, they don't tend to move locations of courts often. It's probably a pretty smart place to own it, but you got to keep it in good working condition, you know. And then there's a whole other set of assets that the Public Building Service has. Office buildings that are now the occupancy levels are really dropping. It's unlikely that the federal employees are going to come back completely like they were pre-pandemic. And then you have an asset where it has a tremendous capital liability, and it doesn't have the demand to fill it anymore. That's not an asset that should be reinvested in. And so that whole part of asset management, the whole disposition side of it, is a huge area for the federal government. It's like a giant attic. You know, for 250 years, the federal government's been buying assets, and it's a lot easier to acquire than it is to dispose. And so you just, over time, you end up with all these things that consume capital and O&M money every year. yet they're marginal at best. They don't really drive the mission needs today, but agencies are kind of stuck with them. And in the short term, it's hard to get rid of them. You got to spend some money, and they don't want to commit the money to that, so they don't. But over time, it really, really hurts kind of that asset portfolio, because it's such a drain on resources, and it spreads kind of utilization all over the place, and no place is really being used fully. A real challenge.
Thanks, Dan and Jack. Well, Chris, you've been very patient, and Chris is unique on the panel in that he has one foot on both sides of the pond. Probably some other places he has a foot too, if he had more feet. But so what's your perspective on this, Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I mean, number one is I think we should be congratulating the federal government here. You know, it's an unprecedented bill, but I think also it's worth thinking about the fact that this bill, in my mind, is the first funding bill that really does have at its heart some basic asset management principles. Now, I know, Jack mentioned before the Surface Transportation Bill, so the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, a few years ago now had requirements for asset management plans, and all of the subrecipients delivered on that, and we've seen lots of variance in the quality of those plans, of course, in terms of those who've paid lip service to it and those who've actually used it as an opportunity to improve their asset management practices. But I think with IIJA, what we've seen here is a bill that really focuses on some value drivers for infrastructure. It focuses on how do we make both regions and the nation as a whole more competitive. So it's thinking about that sort of economic value. It's thinking about the societal value through well-being, through equity. That's a very important consideration within IIJA. And then, as Sita said before, it's also that long-term value. So we've now got an increased focus on climate resilience, on sustainability, hugely important, not just because we want to improve the quality of our built environment and our natural surroundings, but we also need that in order to be more competitive on the international landscape. I think it's also just picking up what Dan said earlier about the sprinkling of funding across assets. That of course is going to happen. I'd like to think that we're starting to move away from that a little bit with some of the allocations of funding here. We're certainly seeing investments in assets sort of very specifically, almost in their own right. We're seeing investments in systems of assets. I think we're also somewhat uniquely, maybe for the first time, starting to see a need to think about systems of systems. So as we think about the whole EV, electric vehicle market, that's not just improving transportation, but that's improving the national electricity grid. It's improving communications and everything else that will enable us to manage those assets. So we've started to get these asset crossovers, which we've not really seen so much in the past. There's still a lot to do. The American Society of Civil Engineers talks about a $2.5 trillion backlog infrastructure deficit. That's a little bit more than what we've got in this bill, for sure. There was a report out, I think it was last year, that talked about a $4.5 trillion to convert the US energy grid. I mean, that's, again, a huge number. And I think just to pick up on another comment that Dan said earlier, we talk about shovel-ready projects all the time, and that's what gets people back to work, gets people busy, starts to have a positive impact on the economy, of course. But this bill in particular, given the size of it, given the longevity of it, we need to be thinking not just about shovel-ready, but planning-ready projects. We need those planning-ready projects to continue that sustained pull out of any economic depression we're in, and then using that to really sort of guide the light of where we go next. And I think at the heart of that, to really make that successful, to really ensure that what we're investing in meets those value drivers I mentioned before, but we've got a very clear plan for how we do that efficiently. We really should be thinking more closely about how we adopt asset management, not just in the individual departments, as Jack said, but more so on a state and national level, building in those infrastructure plans, very much so at a state, as I said, a state and national level.
So Chris, and I don't know what all you're working on in your new position, but I know you had a lot of experience with rail. What are your thoughts on what different outcomes are we going to see with this infusion of new capital?
Well, without sort of going project by project, I mean, I think you've got right now this, I think Jack mentioned it before, no, maybe it was Dan, you've got this very interesting dilemma right now of just what are we going to be using assets for in the future? When you think about all of the property, the real estate that we've got scattered around the country, when you think about all of those transit systems providing commuter services into those commercial real estate, are we going to need those same requirements? Now, I'm not saying that should deter us from investing in transit and rail. I think actually quite the opposite. I think we still need to reinforce rather investments in transit and rail, because it has such a positive impact on the equity of any sort of community or society that those systems serve. So I think that's very important. I think what we'll start to see is areas of the networks that we've all complained about maybe in the past, starting to see some revitalization, starting to see some improvements. And I think, it starts to create some new opportunities for, shorter distance mobility. We're seeing sort of changes in air usage, across the board. There's going to be changes to how we interface with assets. And that is something which I think, as I said, needs careful consideration as we move into this. And of course, going back to my last comment just there, that system of systems approach is something which is really what we need to be focused on through this bill, where we're investing not just in piecemeal fixes across a network, but really making those networks a lot more robust by thinking about the other assets that they connect to, whether it's electricity or whatever else it may be.
That's great. I have a question for Sita, but we're going to ask, I think Bob Leach is on the call, and we're going to ask Bob if he's interested in joining the panel and share some of his background with Army Corps of Engineer and his current work with Wolpert. So if you want to do that, Bob, just let Mike know, and or Nick, and they'll promote you. But Sita, so how does your organization decide where to spend the money? What are its priorities? And how's that going to address the future and all those hard questions?
And I think I appreciate the point that Chris made about planning, because that's going to be key for the sustainment of the funding, to make sure that we have a lot of the projects that are ready to go, but how do we keep things in the queue to keep it going? I can't remember who mentioned this asset management report to Congress that in 21. That's the process to collect that data that we've been improving over the last several years, just to prepare for that reporting. But as part of that, we categorize all of our activities. So we identify those needs over the next 30 years, and they have a category of relative importance that we apply to it, which have risk as kind of the main driver, but also benefits to really allow for some of the the return on investment of the activity, as well as the mission enhancement. How much is this really going to, above and beyond our mission to deliver water and power, what else is that going to provide us? Additional safety, water conservation, a lot of those things to help us guide at least where that fits in terms of a power, dam safety, water investment. So across the different, what Army Corps would consider maybe a business line, that's what that list provides for us, at least as a first cut, to understand where we are in terms of where that activity fits for importance. And then depending on the timing, we apply different criteria to help make those decisions. But to the extent that we can have the consistent methodology, that's important for asset management, documentation, consistent process. That's what we were really instilling right now for this funding, collecting our needs over the next 30 years. So that's something that we worked really hard on, and it's provided us with the benefit of in the tune of $3.2 billion. So we're really excited to get working on it, but understand that to make sure that it provides value, that we can get those projects accomplished. Though that's kind of the starting point that we have as far as the decision making goes to where it gets funded. So that's just our starter there.
Thank you. It's many of us, all of us, it's sometimes refer to asset management as a risk management activity. Mm-hmm. And people at the end of risk management, have this esoteric understanding of risk, including opportunity, which is not necessarily obvious or not necessarily the language it's used to me. And it was a big focus of mine in the original work on 55,000 was when we talked about risk, we always talked about opportunity as well. And I think, it really highlights the value aspect of asset management to be able to say, not just we're going to keep it from losing money, but how do we address the future needs and desires of our country? So thank you. Well, Bob Leach, welcome. How are you today?
I'm good. This has been really interesting. Thank you.
Well, any thoughts you'd like to share as
oh boy, lots. This has been really, really, really good. I think everybody's been kind of echoing some clear themes, obviously, along the lines of asset management. I have to say, having spent 20, almost 30 years with the Corps of Engineers, the last 12 was running their asset management program. And of course, their civil works side of things is, $250 billion worth of built infrastructure that doesn't really fit into any clean box like buildings and things like that. And Sita knows what I'm talking about. These weird things like dams. It's kind of hard to describe them, and FCI doesn't really help in that regard. So things like risk are really, really important to be able to have that. So I was really happy to see the IIJA funding come out finally after a lot of talk over a lot of years about, hey, we need to fix things, and stop these bridges falling down all over the place. And there's clear needs out there, it's really not just aging infrastructure. That's a pet peeve of mine. It's really a decline in performance due to either degradation or what other thing like that. I mean, people start talking about aging stuff. I'm like, I'm aging. What do you mean? What are you really saying? So I like the emphasis from asset management of really a clarity of thinking about that, because it really comes back to performance and what are you describing with that performance? And my experience with civil works is that, and even now with clients working for Woolpert, is that people don't really have clarity about performance. And so in lieu of that, they use dollars to assume that we spent $1 million, therefore we got $1 million worth of value. Which may or may not be true, but if you're not actually measuring performance, if you can't, then it's hard to do. On the other hand, government has to be inefficient. They're doing things, they're providing things, availability and reliability that a normal organization perhaps wouldn't. So there's some inefficiencies, I think, that are allowable for a government in that sense. Mm-hmm. But that's what I really was disappointed to not see in the IIJA, and I'm not blaming anybody for this because I don't think the conversation is elevated to this point yet. But there really wasn't any sense of prioritization. There's no clear national strategy for infrastructure in the US. And I wish there was, because, what's the most important thing? We don't know. How long are these things supposed to last? We don't know. So in lieu of actually having a national infrastructure strategy, it appears to me that the national infrastructure strategy is throw a whole bunch of money at the problem, build a whole bunch of stuff and run it into the ground, and then do it again. So and if that's the case, that's fine. Let's just state that up front. If that's the way we're going to play the game, but if we could do better, then okay, let's do better. And I think it was in the IIJA that actually stated, we're going to give this money to these agencies, and you agencies, you go out and you prioritize it, which is a great thing to do. They're pretty good at doing that. But then you're going to have 47 different #1 projects in the country. So who decides what the most important thing is if funding becomes tight? So this gets back to performance. This gets back to what's the expected life cycle. Is there adequate funding to sustain these things in the future? Those are issues that I would like to see brought to the fore. I think this is a great step in the right direction. I'm really encouraged that the conversation about asset management in general and ISO 55000 has grown to the point where a number of municipal governments, a number of organizations, utilities, they're all reaching out and looking to improve in this area. And the federal government, I think the conversation has gotten really, really dramatic recently in the last probably 5 years. So I'm very, very encouraged to see this money coming out and these conversations happening now about, okay, this is a great shot in the arm, but how do we do the best thing with it going forward? Sorry, that was probably quite an info dump, but I've been thinking this whole time.
That was awesome. That was so Jack Kelly, working on ISO 55011 about how governments can, think about asset management and your work on the National Asset Leadership Strategy. Do you have any reaction to Bob's comment?
No, Bob's just thank him for making it. So the thing that's interesting, so what we're trying to do in this effort that Jim's mentioning is we're trying to help improve the communications between public policymakers who are making decisions that involve asset investments and having them understand the value of reaching out to people with actual asset management expertise, whether it's agencies that have got good programs, whether it's people outside of government who bring expertise to the table, but to essentially help raise the level of awareness of asset management principles and approaches within government so that we do better. And I think that's what the promise is. And what was interesting in this, in taking this on from an international perspective, is learning from other countries how they've done that. And one big difference between the way the US has been approaching asset management and the way a few other countries have is we talk about the term critical infrastructure, but we don't really we don't pay more attention to critical infrastructure from an asset management perspective, and then other countries do. So you've got different countries within sectors that they can consider really critical, like the water sector in Japan, the energy sector in Europe. I mean, those, and in South America. So people in countries that are understanding their national infrastructures from a risk and reward perspective and what's really critical in their country are making decisions now to bring asset management, to require asset management to be brought into the sectors they consider of critical national importance. And we haven't done that yet. And I think that's kind of surprising that we haven't. And in this country, we seem to, even though we get a lot of crises that you would think would prompt us to action, bridges falling down, killing people and so forth, Texas, the electric grid going down, we're being given many opportunities to understand the importance of good asset management. And it's high time that we took those opportunities and did something about it.
All right. Well, I had a question, but I see Chris has his hand up. Let's go to Chris and then Sita.
Yeah, I just wanted to build off what Jack just said there. I think it's absolutely critical that we focus on critical infrastructure. And Jack's right. Those countries that have really had a very national response to the state of their assets and are thinking about how they can improve the quality of those critical assets are the ones which are very competitive on an international landscape. I think it's also important, though, that we also focus on social infrastructure. So when you think about the social infrastructure, the hospitals, the education systems, those sorts of things, those are what's going to help us continue to be competitive both regionally and internationally in the long term. We've got to continue to invest in those assets as well. And I did just pull up one of the questions here, and I think it may be just sort of worth pulling that out because it ties into that equity piece. Somebody had asked the question about how asset management ties to safety, equity, and resiliency. And I think, you mentioned it before, Jim, about asset management really being around managing risks and opportunities. And I think, at the heart of it, when we think about safety, we can think about both risk and opportunity, the same with resilience, making assets more resilient, making organizations more resilient as well in the light of the pandemic. And of course, with the equity piece, really helping us to target, prioritize and target the investments in assets at a system level so that we're driving societal well-being, and we're thinking about how we're impacting both from an economic point of view as well as from a health and safety point of view on the regions which we serve. And a good example of that is a transit agency I was fortunate to work with last year, who had redirected their deployment of electric bus vehicles from a very affluent area which they were serving to a less affluent area because they recognized that it would have a huge impact on a series of determinants of equity, including sort of air quality and service reliability. So, two key determinants there: access to jobs, healthcare, school, that sort of thing. And I thought that was a brilliant example. It really showed some thinking of how they were bringing that into the asset deployment, the project deployment and asset deployment thinking, and how equity was impacting right at the sort of tactical end of asset management.
Good. Thank you, Chris. Sita?
So I might take a little different approach in terms of, I understand the national strategy, but for asset management, but in national or critical infrastructure. But I think that, giving the money to the agencies and allowing them to prioritize based on their stakeholders, the context of their organizations, I think that's absolutely in line with asset management, especially for us. Just because like I mentioned, the capability across our operating entities, or even just the different project benefits that we offer. So I would argue that there's not all assets are created equal. Not all the project benefits that get delivered are the same. And this goes to that equity. If we put in all of the infrastructure into just the dams and the power plants, what about the canals that are delivering water to some of these rural areas? Like, I think you lose some of that if you just focus on the big dams. So to me, I think absolutely this is where asset management allows us, especially at the local level, to capture what the needs are, because it's not a one size fits all. So I would argue that I think at least for us, this helps us to be able to tackle our problems, or address our issues and work with our partners to figure out what the best solution is, because there's just so much, there's just so many different layers that we have to deal with to be able to deliver water, and it might not be the same. And that's why we're so focused on the local relationships that we have to be able to deliver project benefits to all of the American public, not just the more populated areas or the areas that have, that are the most lucrative. So to me, I think that's where asset management with our decision-making framework, that I think that's, so that's my response. And I think, we've done a great job to be able to account for some of those differences and just the different working relationships that we have. It's a little tricky the way that we operate. We're not tricky, I wouldn't say tricky, but there's just a lot for us to consider as we for our operations and delivering project benefits.
complicated.
Right, right.
Jack has two hands up. Okay, Jack. Thank you, Sita.
So Sita makes a great point, and it's a point that, you know, let me come at it at a different, so put my old OMB, my old retired OMB hat back on. And OMB has got to make decisions about, you know, which different agencies get how big a slice of the overall pie. And what OMB doesn't do that I'm aware of, unless they've totally changed themselves in the last 5 years, is bring into that decision-making process the demonstrated competence of the different agencies with respect to asset management. And I think that ought to matter. I think, you know, if you have agencies like the Bureau of Reclamation, like the Corps of Engineers, like the Air Force, and like a handful of others, and it sounds like PBS has made some progress when Dan was there. If you have agencies that clearly get the importance of asset management and for whom you have confidence that they're going to spend whatever money they get in the way that makes the most sense to themselves, their stakeholders, the networks that they interact with, all the kinds of things that Sita mentioned, and you have confidence that they're going to do a good job of that, then I would favor, you know, I would tilt a little bit more. Your boundaries on how much you can tilt, but I would tilt a little bit more to investing in agencies that have demonstrated competence in how they're going to spend whatever money they get. And agencies that haven't demonstrated that, you know, they would have to get some money, but I would want to create an incentive system so they would understand that, you know, if we get our act together like these other folks have, maybe we can do better next year or down the line. But create like an incentive-based system that says money is going to follow competence. And so get with the program.
Now that's a national asset leadership strategy. Money follows competence. I think that's the kind of level we need to deal with. So Dan, I've been waiting to ask you another question to tilt us a little bit, and that's, what can we do? I mean, you have unique perspective, having worked on the Hill and private enterprise, and, you know, more operationally focused at GSA. I mean, it's clear, you know, if you're running a big organization like GSA, you can at least have some opportunity to steer a bit. But, you know, as interested stakeholders and, you know, knowledgeable experts and influencers, what's possible? What can we do? What should we do? What can we do?
Yeah, great question, Jim. So first thing I would say is there's just a gargantuan opportunity. I mean, the amount of money that's been made available through this bill can really be transformational in some areas if it's applied appropriately. And you know, Congress does tend to, you know, they write a check and then they forget, right? They move on to the next thing, and oftentimes doesn't really provide a great framework. A good example of where they have done that over time, you know, is you all mentioned in the transportation world. So in surface transportation and the highways for, gosh, I mean, I remember I worked on the ICE-T legislation in '98, where they created metropolitan planning organizations, and basically states had to put together a 5-year plan for highways for their investments in order to get funded. And so, you know, Congress in that respect acted like a board of directors of a company. You know, in the committee that oversees all that stuff, they got pretty educated through the private sector and other stakeholders that came to them about, you know, how do you make this work? How do you prioritize limited capital when you're trying to achieve certain outcomes? And they decide we can't figure it all out from DC. We're gonna provide money, though. We're gonna create this funding system and provide it to the states, but have certain requirements about how they have to plan and allocate funds around certain purposes. And I think about a lot of the other kind of asset-heavy organizations in government. It doesn't happen to that degree. there's not as much direction or purpose, I think, oftentimes given towards the agencies that have to carry it out. I think at GSA, that's truly the case right now, right? There's some money's getting thrown at it, but there's this massive disruptor called the pandemic, which has really changed how people use office space. And there's no real direction coming forward as to how should this capital, which is now available, how can that help transform sort of that asset base from what exists to what really should be most important, given how the changes in things are being used. And I think about another area, electric vehicles, right? That's another area where there's a lot of money in this legislation to help kind of jumpstart electric vehicle charging. And that's a pretty complicated thing. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than I think most people realize. And I'm not sure the government agencies really have the type of expertise to even approach it. I mean, I think they're, I really hope that Department of Energy and Transportation and others who have, even GSA got like $5 billion for that purpose, that they're reaching out to, I think, private sector expertise for advice and guidance as to how to go about that. So it's transformational. It's not just, putting a bunch of chargers here and there, and then there's no real structure in place to ensure that they endure or that it even works. And they're not overloading the grid in certain places because they throw a bunch of chargers in a bunch of buildings that the network infrastructure can't really support it. I think they really need some outside support, and I hope that some people are listening on this and they turn to a variety of companies that are really the best and brightest in this world and help them figure it out. Because it's better to get it right and be transformational and just push money out the door quickly and then really not have an enduring impact. I think that's the big risk, right? Because there's so much money, there's gonna be pressure to move it out. Got to do it smartly though.
So I go back to my thoughts as you were talking, go back to the interstate highway system. And who could have imagined the impact of the interstate highway system in this country? I'm sure it'd be interesting to go back and research at the time and see what they thought that they were going to do. But it's in ways large and small and diverse. That's impacted every human being in the United States and beyond. Remarkable.
And unleashed a type of economic productivity that was probably hard to imagine when they were committing to it. And I think there are parts of this bill that not quite as large as that, of course, but can also be transformational in their spaces if they do it right. There's a huge opportunity, I think.
Bob, have some more thoughts?
Yeah, I agree completely with what Dan is just saying. And in fact, that's a really good example of the interstate highway system. I mean, that started in the 50s. I mean, look at the national strategy that was behind that. And I don't even think that was completed until the 1990s. Wasn't that the last section built in Colorado or something like that? So very long term. Talk about life cycle perspective. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And by the way, I don't disagree with what Sita was saying either. I think the key there is understanding the constituencies, understanding how you define performance carefully, and that helps you to define really what's critical. So it's not just the big and fancy stuff. And I would argue too that critical is different than risky necessarily. So there's some subtleties there, and that gets to the whole notion of understanding really what we're talking about with asset management. It helps, I think, in terms of promoting common languages and common understanding and more, I'll say precision, that may not be the right word, but better terminology. There's a lot of hand waving, at least in my experience, a lot of assumptions. In lieu of having answers, it seems like agencies and people tend to make assumptions about things. Good things will happen and we'll all look better in the end. type of thing, without actually having a way to track those things. And so I do think surface transportation is actually a really successful example, but that's something that touches just about every citizen in the US. And so as a result, there is a huge constituency, a lot of states very, very interested in that. Every state's got a Department of Transportation. You know, not every state has a Department of Hydropower or Energy or something like that. So how do you replicate that success appropriately across the spectrum of infrastructures? Maybe a way to think about that.
If I could just add real quickly, I think one of the most important things about the surface transportation highway bills is it combined revenues with expenditures, and that's probably the Achilles heel of governmental infrastructure is the financing stream, the revenue stream. And if you don't address that and then have that revenue stream be in proper proportion with the assets, you have a recipe for what most government infrastructure looks like. It's driven into the ground, build it, and they forget about it. And that's really, from like Congress's perspective, it's probably one of the most important things that they can do. GSA actually has a revolving fund that's subject to appropriation. And in the last 10 years, the appropriators basically take back $1.5 billion every year from the revenue stream. And those buildings have been driven into the ground and it's fallen apart. A relative recently phenomenon, but that is probably, like, if there's one thing I could wave a magic wand and fix, would be that. And highways actually have suffered the last probably 15, almost 20 years now, because the revenue stream was continuously constrained as well.
Yeah, well, Chris raised his hand. That's good. So I was just going to have a question for Chris, but let me say I have a question for Chris. We'll let Chris say what he wanted to say, but then we'll kind of start to wrap up and give everybody a chance to make some closing comments after Chris. But we'll let Chris have the last comments too. So Chris, I was going to ask you what if you put whatever you're going to say, go ahead. But I was also going to ask, with your IAM hat on. What does this look like, and how do you see the IAM playing a role in this, or if any, and anything along that line?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I was just going to add a comment to the comments that Bob made there about the national highway system. When you look at the national highway system, it's opened up the US. It's the backbone of what we have as a transportation system, and it's not just for those of us that enjoy road trips. It's freight, it's logistics, it's everything else. I think the challenge for us today, as we look forwards, is how do we think about what that system should perform at in a decade, in 2 decades? And I look at a good example of that is the Basilgate sewage system, which is the sewage system underneath London, the city of London, a sewage system designed to, move the dirty stuff away from the city to prevent the plague, but was so over-engineered at the time. The system is massive. Yeah, it allowed for the growth of an economy and a city and a national and international economy. So that is how we have to think about infrastructure today. When we think about some of these very fundamental changes that we're making to infrastructure, roads are not just for driving cars and trucks along anymore. They're also highways for energy and everything else. When we start to think about it like that, we've got to think about what that infrastructure looks like in 1, 2, 3 decades, not just 1, 2, 3 years. So it's not just patching holes, it's really thinking long term. That's our challenge. And just, you asked about the IAM here. We are a professional body for asset management professionals. We're here to promote the discipline. I think, as I've shared with some of our internal communities over the last 6 months or so, and I think you and I would definitely agree on this. This is our time really now. When we think about asset management, we've talked about improving how we maintain and replace assets for decades, but that's really managing assets. When we think about asset management, the extracting extraction of value from assets, when we think about how that value is measured in terms of, as I said earlier, the economic, social, and long-term value, that's a much harder thing to get your head around, and it requires a much broader process of thinking. We're not just thinking about one asset, we're thinking about systems of systems, as I said. That's what the IAM is focused on right now. That is the committees that we've got in place who are building out guidance and documents to support, education documents to support on things like the climate emergency plan, things like the circular economy, things like the digitalization. How do we fully leverage the opportunities that come with both digitalizing our assets and also using that information to inform decision making on a very grand scale? And we're also focusing on recognizing that when we talk about critical infrastructure, when we talk about social infrastructure, and for that matter, commercial infrastructure, we're not just talking about, this isn't an engineering problem anymore. This requires investors to get involved. It requires economists. It requires sociologists. This is, if you've got an ology after your degree title, you should be involved in this now. I was talking to one university who has started to introduce an infrastructure course to every class, including theatre, which I thought was fantastic, just to make people aware of this. That's what we need to be doing now. We need to be making people very aware of the fact that their livelihoods, their lives depend on something which we largely forget about until it's broken. And we need to start thinking about it in a very different way.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. A lot to think about. So, I know I hate to put on constraints, but if we could go around the room again and just take a minute or two so we don't run over too much, and share any final thoughts, conclusions, whatever you'd like to share. And if I can remember, I think we started with Dan, so we'll start with Dan again.
I'll keep it brief. I just want to say thanks for the opportunity to be here. I think it's a great opportunity for the country with this bill, and look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thanks, Dan. Sita?
I just wanted to echo what Dan said. Thank you for the opportunity. I thought the discussion was great. So appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. Jack?
This has been a great conversation. I really enjoy hearing people's different perspectives. And the one thing I'll say about asset management that still strikes me as surprising in this country is that asset management, from the very first time that I first read ISO 55000, it's like, this is just common sense. There's a lot of it, and you might be able to organize the presentation in a way that would be easier to digest it all. And that's one of my pet peeves, but nonetheless, it is a comprehensive set of common sense. And this is something that, and people, but they hear this term and they're put off. They think they're going to be forced to learn something that they're just tired of learning stuff. And so they don't, it's not learning new things. It's organizing things that you know. And most people have enough practical knowledge with the day-to-day work of asset management. And I don't mean at the managing asset level, I mean at the organizing, what the organization does to achieve results level. That if they could just kind of get by that label and say, let me dig into this a little bit, because there's a lot of people around the world that are excited about it, that think highly of it, that have benefited from it. So I'd like to, before I just dismiss it out of hand, I want to find out why they're so excited. And I wish we would see more of that. And we in the ALN and the IAM are going to continue to promote that idea, but we need more people to join us.
Hey, it's not like there's trillions of dollars involved or anything. That's crazy when you think about that. Bob, how about you?
Well, I think this has been a really interesting conversation, and so I was glad to be able to join up.
Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Yeah. So thanks everybody for that. It gets back to something Chris said about value, really, and elevating that conversation amongst all these federal agencies. I still work with a number of federal agencies, and when I was with the Corps, we basically started working with more and spreading the gospel, I guess you might say, like figuring this thing out. And the interesting thing is, in my experience, these agencies, they're not bad at any of this stuff. You know, they've been around for a number of years. They get their job done. 60-70% of its asset management is in place in most cases. It's just fractured. They're not aware of it. They don't speak the same language. They've been isolated for a number of reasons, business reasons and things like that. So really, ISO 55000 really, to me, just provides a way to kind of start breaking that down and identifying those pieces and leveraging that value, really, to understand this is why this thing exists. This is what we're supposed to deliver. And that really is one of the key things. One of the things that really attracted me to PAS 55 and then 55,000 was it was a tangible way to connect the vague strategic objectives, you know, we all want to be better looking, to the day-to-day work. And that's a way to really start doing that in the businesses, in the agencies, to look at the business processes to do that. And I think this IIJA funding is a great opportunity. I think that's been said several times this afternoon, to spark that conversation in a really meaningful way. I mean, yes, we're just throwing a bunch of money at infrastructure, but we have the opportunity here to do much more with that than simply rebuild things, recapitalize things, and really look long-term and start the better habit of thinking long-term and thinking about value, things like that. So this has been really, really phenomenal. It's nice to see the tribe here.
What a great group of people. I am proud that in our work to this point on the required revision to ISO 55000, that I was taking a facilitator leadership role for the principles. And there's some additional principles in addition to the 4 that are in 55,000. And one of those is integration. And I think the word you just used about that, it's not some foggy concept of like, one IT system or something. It's like, yeah, all these people need to be a part of it, and it needs to be a part of everybody. I think it's just a really important message. Chris.
Yeah, Jim, thanks. Look, great conversation, great panel of speakers here. Super pleased to be involved with it. I just reiterate what you said and what the other speakers have said. This is about collaboration, and it's about working together, and it's about working together across departments and organizations and everything else. And I think, here today representing the Institute of Asset Management, working with the Asset Leadership Network, I think we, the 2 organizations, have a great opportunity to really promote the benefits of asset management to state, local, and the national government. And I think we really need to work hard to do that now. We want to make sure that we're getting the most bang for our buck out of the IIJA Act. And to do that, we need to be thinking a lot more about the asset management that's embedded within there, and pulling it out and making sure that people fully understand how to leverage that to justify where they need to make investment. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think one of the advantages of sessions like this is it helps us learn ways to speak more clearly and effectively and be able to communicate it to our broader audience in a way. I've made several notes here today, and I'll probably go back and review this and write some things down, because those simple statements are a big deal. They get people involved, they draw people in. As Jack said, instead of just throwing a word out there like they should know what it is, we need to make these key points. And it's, we just heard several PowerPoint slides, full of them here today, simple statements of why this makes sense and why it's well, it's not simple, it's not anything hugely beyond what you're already doing. It's making it work together like we work together here today. So thank you all, and I'll turn it back over to Nick.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, what a great roundtable discussion we had here. And I will just close this out by again thanking our patron members and of course our other organizational members. And as well, mentioning that we have a lot of programs upcoming. The first in 2 days, Wednesday, Ashay will talk about how organizations can establish priorities that help better maintain their assets and create more value from them. And then, of course, on Thursday, we have our regular ALN Thursday at 3 program with Richard Culbertson. And then another municipal asset leadership web series next week about the city of Greater Geelong in Australia, all leading up to the March 15th and 16th summit on sustainable value creation from infrastructure asset leadership. So today's discussion was a great thing to precede such a summit. So really excited for that event, and thank you all for helping kind of set the tone, set the stage, and give us some, I think, real clips, some sound bites that we can use to help promote this conversation and the upcoming events. Thanks everyone for participating.